Do you remember how good games would come out and everyone would be happy and they would never have to be remade? It feels like whether we ask for it or not, a game can't start a franchise or become a cult classic without fear of it being remade. The general feeling regarding remakes seems to be,
don't touch my shit, I don't touch your shit. Great.
Okay.
And I get it, but can I tell you a secret? I love remasters. So when Ratchet and Clank got a quote-unquote remake in 2016, I was excited as shit for it, but then it came out and I played it. And I loved it. Seriously, I had the best time. It brought back all my memories of playing the games on PS2, had satisfying gameplay, and I made the unique observation that it looks like a bloody Pixar movie. I played through it twice just to get the Platinum Trophy and thought, this is it. This is the Ratchet and Clank game fans have been waiting for. Holy fuck, did I read the room wrong. There's no question about it. Ratchet and Clank, No Subtitle, is the most controversial game in this entire series, and for good reason. This was the first Ratchet and Clank game in over 3 years. What was an eternity for a series that had pumped out almost yearly releases since 2002. It was the first Ratchet and Clank game being made for Sony's next generation of consoles and promised that we would all be picking our jaws up off the floor after playing it. But maybe most importantly, it was just the first Ratchet and Clank game, or at least a version of it. Insomniac wanted to return to the very beginning and use their 15 years of experience and learnings to bring this classic into the modern era and use it as a way to introduce new fans to the series. This resulted in the best-selling Ratchet and Clank game ever made at the time, but also a backlash so loud from parts of the community crucifying this game and considering it to be an out-and-out low point of the franchise. Begs the question, doesn't it? Was it a success or a failure? It was complicated, is what it was. Before we dive in, let's brush up on our definitions so everyone can keep up as we go along. So grab a buddy and don't fall behind. A remaster is taking a game normally with the original assets, upscaling the graphics, and sometimes adding in some quality of life improvements. A remake is taking the skeleton of a game but rebuilding it from the ground up. New graphics, animation, sometimes even voice acting, you get the idea. A reboot is a redesign like a remake, but it's a new starting point for the series. Sometimes telling a new origin story or retelling the existing one, but making minor or major changes to it along the way. Remaster, remake, reboot. Got it? Good. It's important you know this because Ratchet and Clank No Subtitle gets labeled as many different things. The uneducated call it a remaster, the generous call it a remake, and the cautious call it a reboot. And none of them are really right. This game can only truly be defined as one thing. A movie tie-in game, and Jesus Christ, it's been a minute since we've had one of those dark on our doorstep. Unlike most other movie tie-in games, it's not as simple as putting a line through it, saying it's shit, and calling it a day, because this isn't like other movie tie-in games. This is a tie-in game to a movie that is itself based on the original games. Are you familiar with Nailed It, that Netflix show where they get a bunch of plebs that self-identify as useless bakers, but they try and get them to make super complicated cakes? Well, imagine if that had a companion show where they then brought in professional bakers to try and recreate the monstrosities the plebs put out. Does that sound like a show I'd be interested in watching? Hell yes. I'd gobble that shit up every day of the week. Do I regret having this idea and sharing it on YouTube?
Yes, I do.
Importantly, is that third cake going to turn out as an absolute mess? Almost definitely. But it's probably going to taste bloody delicious. And that's exactly what we got here with Ratchet and Clank No Subtitle. Now, I feel the cake analogy gets my point across pretty well, but just in case, let me explain a little more. For any story jumping from one form of media to film, it has to adapt the story to make it suitable for the screen. It's why Weasley was never our king in the Half-Blood Prince, and why we never got to see Hero from Big Hero 6 fight off an entity made up of the souls of people who were killed during the 1945 nuclear attacks on Hiroshima and Nagasaki because Disney deemed it not to be, quote, family friendly. Cowards. Adapting a video game is no different, because for a film, you have to find something to replace the, video game parts of it.
I want those feathers.
When your base for a movie script is 90% combat, puzzles, and platforming, let's just say you have some tweaking to do. What we were left with post-tweaks were the two main characters, thank God, Captain Quark, Chairman Drek, the Deplanetizer, and 3 original planets. Everything else though basically went fucking see ya. The story branched into something almost entirely new, with new characters being added and existing characters being changed. Better yet, it took a page from Spider-Man 3's book and included 4 villains in its final plot, because the problem with Spider-Man 3 was that it actually didn't have enough villains. So how did this impact Insomniac in the game they were developing? Well, they basically had to now do the opposite of what Rainmaker Entertainment just went through. Instead of figuring out how to adapt the game to a film, they had to work out how to turn that film back into a game. Like adapting to the screen, a game has to take liberties with how it tells its story as well, and this is what we see the most successful tie-in games do. Spider-Man 2 doesn't just give you Doc Ock and 4 scripted fights throughout its whole game, instead, it fills it with more villains, events, and activities that actually make it fun to play. Thankfully, the pizza delivery is pretty one-to-one on that though, so they knew not to mess with any elements that were load-bearing. So how did Insomniac adapt the film for No Subtitle? Well, they wanted to remake the original game, and god damn it, they were going to remake the original game. This meant a big chunk of the characters, planets, and other moments that were left on the cutting room floor for the big screen adaptation, well, Insomniac just dusted them off and whacked them straight back into their game. Only now, they didn't really make sense with the movie's new plot. I mean, they'd been cut out for a reason. And this is the biggest problem with this whole project. The original game didn't work as a movie, so changes needed to be made. Then the movie didn't work out as a new game, so changes needed to be made once again. Think a $40 million game of broken telephone. What it left us with was a game that tried to tie worlds and story elements into a film that had scrapped those same ideas because it didn't make sense to their new plot. This was made even more noticeable by using scenes from the film as cinematics for the game. Sure, it helped alleviate some of the time pressure and development, but did Sony really have to make it so a pop-up would appear every time one of those scenes started or finished just to make sure you really knew this was a scene from the film? These scenes range from fan service moments that didn't translate to the game at all, to entire plot points and character revelations that just make no sense, because one minute you're fighting Quark and you blast his ass to grass, then the next thing we see is him flying over all mopey and saying,
I'm sorry.
Now, the original plan was to not even use any cinematics from the film to sidestep this problem entirely, but Insomniac were confronted once again by their oldest nemesis, that fat little goblin named Time. This time though, that fat little goblin was even worse than normal. Like with any self-respecting movie tie-in game, the game had to release when the movie did. That was kinda one of the big things of a movie tie-in game. This meant they were given a deadline of 10 months to develop this game, so they would be ready to launch it when the movie released, and in true Insomniac fashion, they somehow managed to get that done. Only they didn't have to. Yeah, turns out films are not like games, and release dates are a lot more fluid. And by more fluid, I mean the movie got pushed back a full year, leaving Insomniac in a pretty tough spot. They'd already begun pre-production and eventually full development on Spider-Man during this time, so even though they had more time, they'd already finished the game and only had a skeleton crew of team left that could really only polish what they already had. And what they already had was a game built while numerous drafts and rewrites were happening to the film script, meaning Insomniac really had no idea what they should include in their game or how it was even going to all tie into the eventual movie, thus the clunky cutscenes. These ever-moving goalposts force Insomniac into a narrative corner, leaving them with only one way out. What if we were to tell our story from the perspective of an unreliable narrator, someone so dramatic and egotistical that we could do whatever we wanted?
They're making a game based on a holofilm based on my life?
Despite this basically only being a step away from ending the game with, "and then Ratchet woke up," it helped allow No Subtitle to embrace the absurdity of it all and solidify the idea that none of this is canon. You can, and should, think of this as a spin-off adventure, one that may not even be true because it's Quark telling the story.
But first, they'd have to tackle a brain-eating zombie T-Rex.
Hey, wait a minute. I don't recall no brain-eating zombie T-Rex.
Okay, fine. Killjoy.
And honestly, it really helps approaching this game with that mindset. The less you think of this as something that's trying to replace the original, and the more you think of it as a story happening in another multiverse where slight changes led to a new and independent story, the more you'll be able to just enjoy the game. So what about the actual game? Is it any good? Well, actually, yeah, it is. Being the first and only Ratchet and Clank game made for PS4, and after having such a big gap since Into the Nexus, this truly was the next generation Ratchet and Clank experience we'd all been waiting for since the PS3. Even though recreating planets from the original game didn't necessarily help create a cohesive story, it really was the saving grace of this game, because it's still so much fun to go and explore these different planets and see them looking as good as they do. Smashing crates and collecting bolts are more satisfying than it's ever been, and ideas first introduced in Into the Nexus have returned here. Not too long ago, No Subtitle even got updated to be able to run in 4K at a smooth 60 FPS on the PS5, and it makes it one of the best feeling games in the series, rivaled only by Rift Apart. The very best parts of No Subtitle are the areas of the game where the film has no impact. The times where you forget this is a movie tie-in game altogether. Because this isn't a Metal Gear Solid game, most of the game is made up of actual gameplay and not just cinematics, so forgetting it's a movie tie-in game isn't all that difficult. It is unquestionably one of the best looking games in the series, and many will remember it as a turning point for what graphics could deliver on that hardware. Now, even without taking the flaws of the film into account, this game does have its own unique problems that keep it out of that conversation of best game in the series. Even though the world looks amazing, Ratchet looks wooden and lifeless in cutscenes, with barely any emotion showing through any of his statements.
Are you here for the race?
You know it.
Enthusiasm. I like it.
The 2 times he takes to the air never feel great, and the entire third act from the original game is just gone completely. Thanks to that, it doesn't feel like a full game, and it took me just over 6 hours to beat, which clocked in at around the same time as Into the Nexus, which is commonly considered a game where its biggest flaw was that it wasn't long enough. When judged on its own merit, without comparing it to the movie or even the original game, Ratchet and Clank No Subtitle is a super fun game that has a super clunky story. Does that mean it deserves the hate it receives and should be considered by many to be worse than even the spin-offs? Absolutely not. The DNA of the series we all love is still very much here, and seeing this series on the PS4 is still impressive to this day. Let's not forget either, it was Insomniac's best and fastest selling game at the time, and introduced more people to this series than any Ratchet and Clank game ever had before. While I don't think this game itself is a failure, I do think that what Insomniac wanted to do was, they wanted to go back and recreate their original game and implement all the learnings from the past 15 years and modernize it for a new audience. And that sales pitch is what every fan wanted as well. While yes, from a gameplay point of view, they implemented their learnings, and from a technical point of view, this game is stunning, but it is fundamentally not a recreation of the original game. This failing isn't solely on Insomniac's shoulders. In fact, I think it's the opposite. They were working off a story that was aimed at children, but the fans who loved this game in 2002 aren't kids anymore. The rest of the series took this to heart and matured with its audience, so this new plot almost felt insulting the way it reset us back to square one. But I have a theory on this, and it is backed up by no data at all, so take it with a grain of salt. I think this is a time where the silent majority feels outweighed by the vocal minority. I feel like all I ever hear or read about from this game are people saying it's bad, and if that's you, I totally understand where you're coming from. But for as successful as this game was, how many units and sold, and how accessible it's been made over the last 2 years in different free programs, I would say that most people's experience was probably playing this game, finishing it, and saying,
It was great.
and then probably never thinking about it again. I think I was one of those people when I first played it, and I think people like me probably don't have a great memory of the original 2002 plot unless they played it recently anyway, in which case the story changes honestly don't come across as insulting as much as they just come across as lazy. At the end of the day, let's remember, this game doesn't replace the original. It's still out there, and while for some ungodly reason it's yet to make its way to the PS4 or the PS5, it is still playable today. You don't have to choose between one or the other, and what you're left with is more Ratchet and Clank, and for me, I will always say yes to more from this franchise, especially when they're as much fun to play as No Subtitle is. If you want my thoughts on that original game, or just want to check it out to see how much everything's changed, then I've got you covered in this video right here. I'll see you over there. Let's go!
I'm not gonna lie, daughter had Yagi, her brain fried. My lady Papa Zenny out of